Welcome to The Criminologist, the podcast dedicated to educating and entertaining our listeners. We bring you subject matter experts from around the world and share the latest and greatest evidence-based practices and interventions to help individuals desist from a life of crime and delinquency. This podcast avoids stereotypes and biases in favor of the lived experiences of those we can best learn from. Now, please welcome the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidsson.
Hello and welcome to episode 146 of The Criminologist Podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. This week, we welcome our dear friend, Nicole Kimberley-Staeheli, back to The Criminologist Podcast. You can and should check out her previous contributions to this program. Nicole has appeared previously on episodes 16, 92, and 118. I encourage you to go back and check out those installments of the Criminologist Podcast. I will endeavor to leave the links for those episodes within the program description of this podcast to make it a little bit easier for you to track those episodes down. I won't spend too much time introducing Nicole, as she is about to do just that for you all to kick off this interview, but I will say that Nicole Kimberley-Staeheli is owner and lead consultant for Nicoleranaeconsulting. She is proud to partner with nonprofit, county, state, and federal corrections and social service agencies to support helping professionals and their clients, offering trauma-informed, evidence-based training and coaching. As the owner and lead consultant, Nicole has over 30 years of experience working with clients in crisis due to a variety of struggles, including justice system involvement, victimization, addiction, and marginalization due to medical, social, and economic barriers. She is passionate about combining her years of experience with the latest research to support helping professionals utilize trauma-informed and cognitive behavioral principles to facilitate lasting change in the lives of their clients. We're going to talk about all of that and so much more. Please enjoy my conversation with Nicole Kimberley-Staeheli, and I will see you all on the other side. Welcome back to the show, Nicole. You've been on several times in the past, but nonetheless, why don't we start off, for those who may not have caught those episodes, just introduce yourself to the audience a little bit, highlighting some of your educational and vocational milestones, and then we'll do a deep dive on the topic du jour today, which is the crossroads between cognitive behavioral interventions and being trauma-informed. So reintroduce yourself to kick things off.
Well, thank you so much for having me back. And I love how you said that, the crossroads, how these concepts meet. So this is going to be fun. But yeah, my name is Nicole Kimberley-Staeheli. For the past 3.5 years, I have ran my own consulting business, which is Nicoleranaeconsulting. Before that, I have it's getting closer to 30 years now when I do the math of experience in the criminal justice field, working primarily as a probation officer and then as a cognitive programming coordinator and an evidence-based practices trainer. So lots of field work, really working directly with justice impacted individuals, and then lots of opportunities to teach and to train. So educationally, I'm a Minnesota girl, at least have been for a long time. So I did my BA at Hamline University, and then I have a master's from Bethel. So truly, I've been fascinated by criminal justice work and teaching really since I was a teaching assistant way back in grad school. So cognitive behavioral interventions, trauma-informed work has been a great way for me to bring those really lifelong passions kind of together in this field.
And I know you broke the golden handcuffs, as we say, and severed your relationship with the public sector to make that leap of faith and start your own consulting. How has that been going with Nicole Renee Consulting? You've been keeping busy, I assume?
It has been a blast. It's been about 3.5 years now. And truly, I loved working with the agencies, but now I really get to work and train and teach and talk about what I'm passionate about. And for many years, it really has been the cognitive behavioral work and the trauma work. So I do a couple of things primarily. I do a lot of curriculum training. So I train decision points. I train thinking for a change, the domestic violence education program. So I've had amazing opportunities to train those curriculum really all over the United States. So that's been a lot of fun. And then the other big piece of the work that I love is this trauma-informed understanding trauma-informed care and how to be trauma responsive in kind of our daily work for professionals. So along those lines, I'm super excited. Got to share this. I just launched what I'm calling the Trauma Perspectives Project about a month or two ago. And it was really my goal was to take all of the training and work I've done over the years and bring it together, not so much in a prescriptive model, but just as, that's why I call it a project, but a space where these trainings are available, everything from foundational, introductory trainings, all the way up to some really advanced workshops for folks who have really done a lot of trauma-informed work already. And I wanted to bring those together kind of under one umbrella, offer agencies opportunities to explore how they want to be trauma-informed, what that can look like. So I offer the trainings. I do a lot of coaching as well. So really wanting to be a resource, maybe to smaller agencies too, who don't have the resources to kind of get on board with some of the more prescriptive models that can be a little overwhelming in terms of cost and in terms of time, and really can just be too much for some smaller agencies. So that's the goal of the Trauma Perspectives Project. So that's been my latest adventure, if you will.
I love that because, well, as we're about to discover during the course of this interview, trauma really permeates so much of what we do in human services and in corrections. So I love where you're going with that Trauma Perspectives Project. Speaking of how trauma infuses itself into a lot of what we do in human services, you and I both recently attended an awesome statewide conference here in our home state of Minnesota, one of which you actually facilitated 2 awesome sessions. I attended them both. They were amazing. I want to talk in particular about the afternoon session, that you did, Nicole, which was entitled Reimagining Just Do COG, a trauma-informed perspective on CBIs, or cognitive behavioral interventions. Now, you and I love talking about how to best craft a holistic strategy for those we serve. And to that end, I love hearing how you cited James Bonta himself in his acknowledgement of ACE's literature, those adverse childhood experiences. Share a bit of that with us, please, about, again, even the co-creator, if you will, of our risk-need responsivity framework is beginning to acknowledge the importance of trauma in working with justice-involved individuals.
Okay, true confessions. I was absolutely giddy when I discovered Dr. Bonta's article. Published it on LinkedIn, and it was based on, he was doing a webinar in Japan. Apparently, they had just translated The Psychology of Criminal Conduct into Japanese, right? So in the midst of this conversation he was having, they asked about the impact of trauma. And so that's where he started to talk about, the importance of the ACEs research, recognizing that we didn't have the research on adverse childhood experiences and really on trauma back when they first started creating, the principles of R&R. That research, understanding the impact on the brain, just really wasn't around yet. So in his article, he really emphasized that one thing we need to do as practitioners is to recognize if our clients have experienced adverse childhood experiences, if they truly have histories of trauma. This is going to impact how we then deliver our treatment, which our treatment, right, is CBIs. So for me, it was exciting because, a lot of things, but really, I spent my entire career with what I will say is like a foot in both camps. I was doing cognitive behavioral work and trauma work going on almost 20 years ago now. And oftentimes it was seen as an adversarial kind of process. You either did COG or you did trauma. You didn't talk about both. Trauma is this issue over here. And really, Nicole, if you're not a therapist, are you sure you should even be going there? Yeah, we should absolutely be going there. Because what we know from the research, and you talked about this a minute ago, Joe, right? So many of the clients we work with, clients in crisis, whether it's human services, justice system involvement, they've experienced trauma. So for me, I guess Dr. Banta's article and that kind of reflection from him of all people, that no, we need to think about trauma, we need to understand this research, and we need to take that into consideration when we're working with clients, was, I don't know, not a justification, but just it kind of showed me that all these experiences I'd had over the years, because when I worked with clients who did trauma work and did the COG work, it made a difference when we did both. So this really just kind of brought all that to fruition.
I have been blessed to have developed a professional relationship with Dr. Banta. And by that, I mean, he returns my emails. But to your point, I know he's always open when new editions of the Psychology of Criminal Conduct come out to review the landscape. And he has acknowledged that when the first edition came out, and I know they're just going to press with the 7th edition now, we didn't know everything we knew about trauma back then. Or to that end, I know that even stuff around the emerging desistance models was not noted in those earlier iterations of Psychology of Criminal Conduct, or by extension, the risk need responsivity framework. And that's another thing that they're starting to take a look at. So kudos to Dr. Banta and his team, always upgrading and updating that framework. A lot of what you're going to talk about when we talk about the place of cognitive behavioral interventions and the efficacy of those interventions if we don't address trauma has to do with neuroscience, Nicole. And I don't want our listeners' eyes to gloss over. So if possible, can you begin by just maybe giving them an introductory, a 101 version of neuroscience, and then really talk about what the practitioner should at least begin to know about neuroscience as it relates to their clients?
All right, so that phrase neuroscience can sound a little intimidating, right? Basically, what it's referring to is just how our brain functions, how our nervous system functions, how these things work together. But here's the thing. With the clients we work with, there's a couple of things we really need to be aware of. Because again, our clients have experienced significant trauma. We know this. We know this from an insane amount of research over many, many years. Trauma impacts how our brains function. And so I think as we really dive into looking at this crossroads of trauma-informed work in COG, what are we talking about in COG? We're talking about how we think, how we can recognize our thinking. So we need to understand, though, that for our clients, there's some challenges. And essentially, when we think about it, when we're overwhelmed by a traumatic experience, when we've been unable to keep ourselves safe, our autonomic nervous system kicks in and we react. Fight, flight, freeze mode, right? We've all heard of that. It's an adaptive reaction to keep ourselves safe. But what happens for clients who have experienced a lot of trauma and haven't been able to resolve those experiences is that adaptive state really becomes more of, and this is Dr. Bruce Perry's language, but maladaptive traits, ways of living, ways of being, ways of surviving that our clients don't even recognize. So if we're in this state, essentially what we're talking about is that we get stuck in that kind of reactive fight, flight, and freeze mode. So when that happens, our clients experience higher levels of chemicals in their brains. They're hypervigilant. They're always on the outlook for a threat because, again, they've learned the world isn't safe, right? So if their brains are in this kind of elevated state, it doesn't take much for a trauma reaction to kick in. The other piece we really want to understand from a neuroscience perspective in working with our clients is many of them have experienced, again, those adverse childhood experiences we talked about. So it's not just about the present day reactions, but it's how those past experiences have impacted how their brains develop. So for many of the clients we're working with, they have a lot of really strong neural connections back in the reptilian part of the brain that is responsible for reacting to threat. They have fewer connections in the amygdala, which means they struggle to manage their emotions, and even fewer connections still up in this frontal cortex, that executive functioning center of our brain, right? Where we can think rationally and abstractly, when we can think about long-term consequences, when we can be creative. So it's not to say that there's something wrong with how their brains develop, they just develop differently based on the need to keep themselves safe. That really impacts our clients and how we interact with them today.
I have learned so much from our mutual friend and friend of the podcast, Dr. Jared Brown, about neurocriminology and neuroscience. And the more I reflect on it, Nicole, and I'm sure you'll agree, I realize it's just such a travesty that we're not training even on an introductory level this to our practitioners who we expect to implement these cognitive behavioral interventions without having that basic backdrop. I think the good news is, and you probably agree, as a field, we are moving closer to getting the practitioner, the probation parole officer, to understand the impact and the efficacy of cognitive interventions. But as you point out, that all rests upon certain assumptions, which our probation officers, if they're not aware of the neuroscience, just aren't aware. It's almost a really crude analogy, but it's almost like, okay, great, we've got you all practicing a certain medical procedure, but if we didn't tell you that 20% of your patients have an allergy that the medication won't take, what's the point? And if we leave them in the dark about trauma and about that brain science, we're really doing a disservice to those POs who think they're doing a bang up job because they're adhering to the research around cognitive behavioral interventions. So to that end, share some of your insights on the role, we'll stay on the brain path here, the role of the frontal cortex in the human brain, and more to the point, the implications for effective cognitive behavioral interventions.
Well, I first just want to say, I don't think that was a crude analogy. I think it was a really good analogy, except that I would flip your statistics. 80% of our clients versus 20, because we know research on trauma, anywhere from 75 to 95% of our clients have experienced significant trauma. So we're really talking about the majority of the clients that we're working with, at least within the justice system, right? So just to throw that out there. But the other piece of that too is then for the practitioner, and I promise I'll circle back around to the frontal cortex, I promise. But for the practitioner who is facilitating cognitive behavioral interventions, they're following the programs, they've been trained, they're building working alliances, and that they still feel like this isn't effective. Why isn't it working better? Why are my clients struggling so much? That kind of gap, that's where I think this information can help us understand that. And by shifting our perspective, even just in some small ways, and introducing some additional ways of using cognitive behavioral interventions through that lens of trauma, I think we can make a big difference. We can make a big change. So I guess I share that at this point to say that's why I think this information on neuroscience and understanding some of these pieces we're talking about is so important, right? So basically, when you think about what I described in terms of how trauma's impacted the brain, it also impacts how we process information. That's the reality for many of our clients. If they spend a lot of time in this reptilian part of their brain, if they are in a very reactive mode, if their brains have learned that we need to keep ourselves safe, if that is the first reaction, what happens when we're hijacked, and it's really what it is, when we're in that reptilian part of our brain, we can't access the frontal cortex. We can't get to the executive functioning center of our brain, that very space where all of this cog work takes place. Our ability to access the frontal cortex really goes offline when we are triggered, when we're reacting, when we're experiencing some of those trauma reactions. So that's maybe an extreme, right? That's when the client is truly re-traumatized. Even if that doesn't happen, because I've had that question. Well, Nicole, you're saying every time a client is struggling to figure something out or to understand this concept, they're experiencing a trauma reaction. Not necessarily. But what happens for all of us really in our brains is our ability to access that frontal cortex is hinged on our abilities to manage and regulate our emotions. So the more elevated we are, the more fearful we are, the more of a state of alarm or even on kind of high alert, the more we're going to struggle even every day to, again, stay focused in that frontal cortex. So basically, if you ever just think about it, you ever had a day where you were just really struggling? Maybe multitasking, maybe you had, a sick partner or something was going on in your home life. And then you add to that, maybe you had a packed day of clients and it felt like every client coming in was struggling. Every client had a god-awful story to tell, or every client was really just kind of combatant with you. And throughout the day, you maybe feel like you're just getting more and more frustrated, feeling more and more overwhelmed. Your levels of stress are going up higher and higher. That impacts all of us. And that impacts how we process information. So the more elevated those stress levels are, those arousal levels are, the more we struggle to, again, stay focused with our executive functioning center. So for all of us, we fall into automatic thinking. We start to get very concrete. We start to maybe get tunnel vision this way or that way. We get more reactive as the arousal levels in our brains adjust to the life circumstances we're dealing with. So it's not just for our clients, it's really for all of us.
When you were presenting this information last week, Nicole, I'm going to be honest, my head started to think, okay, I love where she's going with this. How could we reframe this in a training platform or even an activity? And I thought about, okay, to get this point across about how you're really sort of hobbled without the use of that frontal cortex and that executive functioning, I thought, okay, Nicole, what if you got like 6 volunteers up here and half the group, you said you can use your phones and your iPads and your laptops. And then the other group couldn't use any devices, but then you just sort of launched into, I don't know, like a trivia contest or something. And then obviously the group that didn't have their devices would theoretically get their butts kicked. And they would say, well, this isn't fair, Nicole. You're letting them use their smartphones to look stuff up. But you can make the point, well, this is what it's like when you've got a client in trauma who you're expecting to understand your thinking for a change curricula or decision points or whatever you're trying to instill, but they're deprived from accessing that executive function. It's the same as, well, you can't use all of your electronics, so to speak. I literally just made this up. We'll see if this ever comes to fruition, but.
Well, I love that idea. And again, it's about how we learn for all of us. If we are struggling, if we are experiencing high levels of stress, if we're feeling overwhelmed, we are going to struggle to be mindful, to be present, to pay attention, all of those things. But I think what we do a disservice to with our clients is we see that as defiant behavior, that they're not paying attention or that they're not invested enough, without understanding that it really is about how our brains are processing information.
To that end, and a little bit related, I know you talk a lot about the value of instilling a sense of safety. Now, when I talk about this, when I train on risk needs responsivity and assessments and stuff, I talk about, I frame that within sort of the responsivity lane of people aren't going to learn unless they feel safe. But can you expand on how that notion applies to better outcomes with cognitive behavioral interventions as well? That, again, instilling a sense of safety.
I would take what you say and I would take it one step further. We're not able to learn if we don't feel safe. And again, it goes back to how we process information. Safety, well, first of all, is not something that our clients typically feel, right? I mean, again, histories of trauma teach you that the world isn't safe and that you aren't able to keep yourself safe. When we're working with involuntary clients whom are maybe working with us because it's one of the, they're in the criminal justice system because they committed maybe one of the worst things they've ever done. So we're in a space that we have power and control over these clients. Just those two simple facts can be enough to create a lack of safety, right? So what do we do then? So when you think about safety, when we think about how to help clients understand that they're free from threat, that they're accepted, that we have authentic connections with them, that they'll be seen and heard and understood. Now, those are things we all talk about in terms of building working alliances with clients, right? Or therapeutic alliances, whatever language you use. But what those experiences also do is literally help their brains process information in a different way. When we feel safe, those arousal levels that I was talking about, those lower. That tendency to come back to this reptilian part of the brain that's going to react to a perception of threat, that's not going to happen if I feel safe, if I don't feel threatened. So therefore, that gives us an ability to, again, access that frontal cortex, to be able to be focused, to think about the present, not to be driven by past reactions to experiences, to think about the future, to be creative, to be able to access memories, to name and identify our feelings. Those are all abilities that are really contingent on our ability to, again, be in the frontal cortex and to have those arousal levels lowered in our brains. So being safer, I would say safer, not safe, because for many of our clients, it's a continuum. We have to recognize that. The safer they can be with us, the safer environments you can create if you're doing a group intervention, that will literally change how their brains are able to process information. The other piece I want to add on to that real quick, Joe, is our brains learn from our experiences. And this is an encouraging piece for our clients to understand too. No, because I will talk about this neuroscience when I work directly with justice impacted individuals, when I'm facilitating interventions with clients. And it's a hopeful understanding. It's a hopeful perception. If we explain to our clients that your brain was hardwired in a certain way to keep you safe, and the decisions you're making, the things you're doing aren't necessarily bad or antisocial, and I know we're going to talk about this, but that they really were survival mechanisms. Like, you've survived it to this point, like, but you can learn to do things differently. So when we create safer experiences for our clients, it also gives their brains opportunities to make new connections. So it's part of the brain that was so hardwired back here, we can shift some of those connections. We can increase their ability to get to that frontal cortex and to manage and regulate those emotions in the mid part of the brain, their amygdala. So these safer experiences will literally change how the brains process information.
You just alluded to it, so let's go there. Talk about what you refer to as rated R thinking.
So I wish I could take full, what's the word I'm looking for? It wasn't my phrase. Whatever the word is I'm looking for. It wasn't my phrase to start. A client of mine, actually, in a training that I was doing, I think it was a Thinking for Change training, because what I was searching for in that training was a way to describe this antisocial thinking, thinking errors, all of these labels we have for the thinking that causes our clients to struggle, the thinking that leads to behaviors, right? And so my client in the training was like rated R thinking. I'm like, yes, I like that. Rated R thinking. We typically think of it, again, as that antisocial thinking, right? We define it as thinking errors, as risky thinking. And traditionally, when we've talked about cognitive behavioral interventions, what do? We label the thinking for the purpose of understanding how the thinking is controlling the behavior. So I think we do it from a good space. But really what we do then is to focus on the link between thinking and behavior, and really about behavior change. And I think when we're doing that, we miss a couple of different pieces. I think we really miss is the function of that thinking, and understanding that it's not just that you have antisocial thinking that we need to restructure so you can do things differently. But again, back to what I was saying earlier, understanding that those thoughts, no matter how rated R they look, no matter how ugly or scary they can sound, those thoughts served a purpose. And it's not just about trying to change the thought to change the behavior. I think we really have to understand that piece of the function of that thinking.
I always think it's really important, the language that we use. I always endeavor to do this, even, for example, when I'm training new assessment trainers to, for example, we throw that term around risky so much and we forget that's landing on the client, maybe not as we're intending it. It's almost like, again, we'll go back to the analogy. Well, if you go to your physician and they're just throwing around that term unhealthy in abundance, that's going to have an effect on you versus reframing that as something that doesn't feel as, what's the word I'm looking for? Shaming, I guess. Yeah. You explore this as well when you reflected on the language we use and what we tell our clients about cognitive behavioral interventions, but what they actually hear about those interventions based on their experience. Can you review that just a little bit to give some context to the listener?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's good to talk about that and then think about a new way of describing this R-rated thinking. So I think that'll be a good connection there. So absolutely. Because you think about it, what are we telling our clients? We tell them basic premise of COG, our thinking controls our behavior. Now we're telling our clients, there's something wrong with your thinking. It's antisocial. You have some thinking errors. It's dysfunctional. And that thinking is causing you to commit antisocial behavior, to hurt the people you care about, to, whatever that behavior is. But if you think about it, what is our client really hearing? Well, there's something wrong with me. There's something wrong with my thinking. Well, where did my thinking come from? Well, that came from how I was brought up, my family, my neighborhood. So you're telling me there's something wrong with my neighborhood, with my family. So that word shaming, Joe, I think is honestly right on target. We don't intend to do that as practitioners. We're not trying to shame our clients. I'm not trying to say that when we use this language. But I also think we don't fully appreciate the impact of really focusing on there is something wrong with your thinking. Because really, that's what our clients are hearing. That's the lens. So I have to change how I think, which is really about who I am. And then I have to change my behavior. So right off the bat, I think we kind of stack the deck against us. So we create this space that can feel very shaming, as we've said. Clients get defensive. Here's the thing about shame. Shame impacts our brains in the same way that trauma does. Shame is an overwhelming experience. Shame can trigger those same autonomic nervous system reactions, that same dependence back here in this reptilian reactive part of our brain. So again, if your clients have already experienced trauma, now they're feeling this sense of shame. Well, again, their ability to access this frontal lobe, our ability to connect with them is, we're already creating barriers, maybe is a way to think about it. So my question is, what I want to think about, because I'm not saying we shouldn't do COG. I'm not in the slightest, but I still train so many curriculum as I was sharing. I believe in the work that we do. I believe we can reframe it in a sense that can really help increase the effectiveness of it. So that gets into this idea of, is there another way to think of this rated R thinking? Well, what if we called it reactive thinking? What if we thought about it that this is thinking that has a purpose and that has a function? And if we understand that the client is trying to meet some kind of innate basic need with these thinking patterns, well, then we shift our focus not just from changing an external behavior, but understanding the internal need, and then exploring with the client, how do we fill that need? How do we meet that need? Maybe a way to kind of give an example, maybe, right? So a lot of clients I work with, and I know we're going to talk about this a little bit more later on, we were thinking, I work a lot with clients who commit acts of domestic violence, right? I mentioned the domestic violence education program that I've co-authored and I train. Many of those clients have committed some pretty horrific violent acts. I'm not trying to justify their behavior. But what do we know about clients who commit acts of domestic violence? We know they typically have histories of adverse childhood experiences, histories of abuse, neglect. We also know that many clients who commit acts of domestic violence are shame-prone individuals. We know that they have unresolved histories of trauma. They often struggle with chemical dependency. So much of these factors really relate to exactly what we're talking about in terms of the reactivity of their thinking. If we look at the impact their childhood experiences, their traumatic experiences have on how they are coping today. Remember what we were talking about earlier? We all recognize fight, flight, freeze mode, right? We all understand that. Well, what if the client who is committing an act of violence is, at least in part, the context of that violence is they are in this reactive space of their brain, where they are overwhelmed currently, where they are struggling with a perception of a threat or not feeling safe. And what have they learned? What do they do when they don't feel safe? They fight. They attack. They hurt someone else before they can be hurt. One of my favorite phrases, and it's really short, but Dr. Brene Brown, hurting people hurt others. So again, I'm not trying to justify why. I'm not trying to justify the behavior, but we need to understand what's driving that behavior. And then how do we respond to it?
I might steal that reactive thinking from you in my training role, because again, I think we just throw around those terminology, delinquent associates, antisocial friends, problem drinking, whatever it might be. But we don't bother thinking about how is that landing on the client whom I'm trying to change away from those behaviors. Yes, Guy would be proud. We've got this down. We understand the importance of the thought behavior link. But as I reflect on groups I've co-facilitated or one-on-one interventions I've done, I'm just questioning myself to impress that upon the client. Sadly, how often did I go to, so let's look at your last probation violation. Let's look at your criminal offense. And that's the template we're using to illustrate the thought behavior link. Is there criminal behavior versus why don't we start out with some good things like why you played sports? Well, I'll illustrate the thought behavior link, or why you like a certain food or whatever it is. But we're just so gung-ho to get to the maladaptive thinking. We don't realize you're really turning off the client to get that principle across. Baby steps up to it maybe first. We love talking about desistance on this program, as you know, and a big part of the desistance process is one's identity. Talk, if you will, about the role of identity in cognitive behavioral interventions.
I think it gets at the example that you just shared, that when we're trying to introduce this concept to clients, we automatically talk about a behavior, so something external to them. And we typically talk about a behavior that might be one of the worst things they've ever done, right? And so again, we're automatically creating barriers before we even start to have the conversation. So I think, again, so if it's reactive thinking, back to how I was describing that thinking, if we're understanding this thinking not necessarily as antisocial or adverse or delinquent, but understanding that this reactive thinking had a function and a purpose. Well, then how do we understand what the function is? And I think, again, that ties into that sense of identity. So a couple of things in terms of trauma and identity before I really jump into directly answering your question. Is that okay? All right. Joe's giving me the okay sign, guys. So trauma in so many ways really alienates us from ourselves. So you think about a traumatic experience is, again, one that overwhelms you. It overwhelms you physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. You are faced by a life-threatening event and you couldn't keep yourself safe. That is the very core of a traumatic experience. That changes how you see yourself. It changes how you understand your role in the world. It maybe changes maybe it does change your ability to connect and interact with others. So for individuals who are really struggling with that ability to even know themselves, and we start consistently bringing up behaviors, well, their behavior can almost become the lens through which they see themselves. And if my behavior is that of an abuser, not mine terms, but our client's terms, right? If that behavior is that of I'm a drug user, that's not about who you are, it's about the actions that you're doing. And we reinforce that when we talk about COGS solely from the perception of we need to change these external behaviors. So taking a step back from that, understanding that trauma inhibits that ability to really know ourselves. How do we use cognitive behavioral interventions to help restore that sense of self? Now, it maybe sounds like I'm treading into therapeutic work, and I'm not trying to argue that. It really is about being trauma responsive. So where do we start? Like we start again with those safer experiences that we were talking about, right? Clients have to feel safe. So we establish that sense of safety. We give them some basic skills to regulate and to manage emotions. And that can be done with so many different things. And a lot of what the work we already do reflects that. We talk about empathy, right? We talk about meeting clients where they're at. We talk about building these relationships. Those are all means of helping our clients regulate these emotional experiences. So now we can be in a safe space when our clients feel safe. Now we can start to talk about who do you want to be? What are your goals for the future? What are your values? What's important to you? Can we think about behaviors that you do not as in terms of labeling those external behaviors, but do they align with the person that you want to be? And what does that person look like? Maybe a nice analogy, metaphor, illustration, that's the word. A nice illustration of this might be, and I have this quote I know in the training that you attended with me, Joe, last week. One of my clients in the domestic violence education program came up to me towards the end of the program, and he's like, you know what, bottom line, Nicole, he's like, I want to be more than the worst thing I've ever done. He's like, I want that. That's what I want. Like, well, let's explore then. What is that I want more than? Like, what does that more than look like? So we had those conversations, and that talked about how do you, well, he's like, I want to be present as a father. And he's like, and if I want to be a father to my kid, if I want to be the father who's hanging out and showing up at the baseball games, he's like, I have to be able to manage my emotions. I have to build my sense of self-control. He's like, I have to change how I react so I don't get myself locked up, so I don't end up hurting people. And I was like, yeah, that's a great start. But the focus for him wasn't about we're just going to change this behavior. It's about I want to be the father who can show up at my kids' baseball games every Saturday. So what do I need to do to be that person? We're still doing the same work. It's a shift in perception. I'll get the word out there for us. But it's also then a strength-based approach to working with our clients. That's what you're saying about desistance, right? It's all about how do we build up their strengths? How do we help them restore their sense of who they are and who they want to be?
And even the fact that that client used that terminology, I want to be more than, it just strikes me as, again, it's strength based. It's approach goals versus being stop being that person you were, which sadly I think is sort of the state of correction. Stop being that drunk driver. Stop being that domestic violence offender. Stop being that drug abuser. Yeah, let's simply shift the perspective that your job is to instill a sense of hope. And what are your approach goals? You want to be more than who do you want to be, not who do you want to stop being?
Joe, I'm so glad you brought up the concept of hope because I hadn't yet, and I wish I had. Because here's the thing, hope is an incredibly powerful experience that we're just starting to really explore and how it impacts clients in crisis, justice impacted folks, working with us, working with human services, all of those different areas. Because it's so easy for us to think of hope as a feeling, as an emotion. But how many of our clients will tell us they feel hopeless? We hear it, even if they don't use the words, we see it. They don't think they can change. They don't think they can make a difference. They don't think life will ever get better. So we see this hopelessness. But here's the thing, we can think of hope as a thought process. So we're starting to talk about how do we look at COG differently. Hope is a thought process. And when we start to shift those perceptions, we can start to help our clients build up a sense of self-efficacy, the belief that they can be successful, a sense of agency, the belief that they can change. So hope is such an integral part of all of the work we do. We talk about it in trauma-informed work. I know they talk about it in assistance work. So that's just one in so many ways that so many of these areas of research are coming together that I really think that are just going to best support our clients.
And to that end, you mentioned things such as hope and agency, and regular listeners of the program who pick up on a lot of the themes of assistance that my guest and I are always talking about, I'm sure they recognize those things as well as you were speaking, Nicole, establishing a sense of safety. I mentioned identity, sense of self, hope, agency, self-efficacy. So they're not wrong, because you and I have come to the conclusion that much of the assistance literature aligns quite nicely with the trauma literature. And to that end, you and I have partnered to create our program, if you will, entitled TIDES, stands for Trauma Informed Desistance, where we do, in fact, bundle a lot of these principles together and hopefully point out to folks that it's not a matter of recreating the wheel if you want to endeavor to be trauma informed, if you will, and you're also intrigued by the emerging desistance models. The good is this, folks, it's sort of a 2-for-1, because there are a lot of common denominators here. And I know you and I have talked about this quite extensively, Nicole. We feel that the application of interventions can sort of steal from each of those buckets of knowledge as well, which is what we did with our TIDES program.
We just want to build on the good work that we already do in corrections, right? And if we look at it from that perception of understanding, it's not just about what was wrong with you, which I think in many ways is that more of a traditional look at and how we use COG, what's wrong with you and let's change it, but what's happened to you, that's where the trauma-informed work comes in. And then I think the other piece of it is to think about is what will you do? What's working for you now? What will work for you in the future? And that's where that desistance emphasis comes in, right? Not just about pathways in, about how you got into the system or in the space that you're at, but how do we help you move on and look at things differently? Restore a sense of who you are, figure out where you want to be and who you want to be in the future. So yeah, I'm excited about the work we've been doing together. The research is fascinating, but it also has so many practical implications for the daily work that we do as professionals. So that's what I'm excited to continue to share. And so excited we got to start that conversation today again. And yeah.
And if you're intrigued, reach out to Nicole or I, and we can talk to you about our TIDES program and perhaps partnering, piloting some of the work that we've been putting into this collaboration. Nicole, if folks want to reach out to you for your consulting and or training services, how can they do so?
So LinkedIn is a great way to connect with me. If you just nicoleranaeconsulting, it'll pop right up onto my LinkedIn page. I post there about trainings. I share research. I love to connect with others on LinkedIn. Website's a work in progress, but I know Joe has my email and can post that with information on the show as well. So I really encourage folks connect with me on LinkedIn, email, reach out to me. Love to talk, love to explore more about the work I'm doing, share more about the Trauma Perspectives Project in terms of really helping agencies become trauma informed and trauma responsive in a way that is going to really work and fit for your specific agency and situation.
I will indeed leave your email address in the description of this podcast episode so folks can just go there for that address, or like you said, contact you through LinkedIn. Nicole, great seeing you again, and I look forward to our next collaboration. And or reach out to us, folks, if you're interested in learning about the intersection of desistance and trauma through our TIDES approach. Nicole, thank you so much. We'll see you next time.
Thanks so much for having me, Joe. It's been great. Take care.
Thanks again to Nicole Kimberley-Staeheli for joining us on the Criminologist podcast to talk about the intersection of effective cognitive behavioral interventions and being trauma informed. Well done, Nicole. And if you were intrigued about the other intersection that we mentioned in this episode, that of trauma and desistance, then please reach out for more information to us as to our TIDES project. Again, that's trauma-informed desistance. We think you are going to love what Nicole and I have to share with you and or your agency. I have left Nicole's email address in the episode description of this program, along with some other related links. I encourage you to check those out. We will be back next week with a fresh episode. And in the coming weeks, look forward to Dr. Jared Brown returning to the podcast to continue with his series in which he highlights case studies, if you will, of various notorious serial killers. And also in the coming weeks, we will continue to partner with the American Probation and Parole Association, specifically their International Relations Committee, shining a light on our international partners around the globe in correction. So look for those particular episodes as well. In the meantime, you may contact the show or reach out to us through our website, the Paragon Group, LLC.com, for trainings or presentations as to core correctional skills, implementation, program design, or of course, the topic of desistance from crime. If you have questions or comments as to this podcast, feel free to contact the show via our email at thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. That's thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. Remember to follow us through our Facebook and Instagram pages at The Criminologist. New fun images are being added all the time to those feeds. You don't want to miss out. The Criminologist Media Group is now also on Twitter. Give us a follow at Crim Media Group. That's CRIM Media Group. You may also connect with me, Joseph Arvidsson, or Nicole Kimberley-Staeheli on LinkedIn. And follow both the Criminologist Podcast and the Paragon Group on our LinkedIn pages. Hey, lastly, if you've not already done so, check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminologist, for additional content as to the themes of this podcast. Merchandise is available. If you go to the Paragon Group, LLC.com, search for the tab entitled Shop, and you'll get details on how to secure your very own Criminologist coffee mug, refrigerator magnet, and or pen. And if you believe in what we're doing on the show, if you're part of the movement, please spread the word, tell a friend or a coworker or a colleague about us. Ask them to subscribe to the show, and of course, do so yourself if you've not already done so. And always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us.
But again, back to what I was saying earlier, understanding that those thoughts, no matter how rated R they look, no matter how ugly or scary they can sound, those thoughts served a purpose. And it's not just about trying to change the thought to change the behavior. I think we really have to understand that piece of the function of that thinking.
The Criminologist Podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, or training opportunities, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. If you enjoyed the show, you can find more content and videos on our YouTube channel, The Criminologist. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Both the Criminologist Podcast and the Criminologist channel are brought to you by the Criminologist Media Group. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.